Welcome to part 2 of our screencast for our curriculum comparison with triangulated analysis assignment, and this is the best practices section. So I left off talking about how I was describing the practices that I found in my program. So what I really just did was I continued to go through the program and find all the examples of vocabulary instruction that I could. I'm not getting this to scroll. Here we go. I noted that, here's my next piece. If I continue, the teacher's guide also has not just this, oh, I'm sorry, I can't get this to scroll. There we go. It doesn't just have this embedded vocabulary instruction, but then they also go into kind of what you do on day 1, what you do on day 2, what you do on day 3 for just particular practice for the kids. So let me go find that. Sorry, this is annoying for me to scroll this, I know. Okay. Oh my goodness. They read a lot of text in this program. Which is good, right? Okay. So, oh wait, you know what? I'm going to have to go find this after my differentiated instruction. Okay, hold on. Let me see if I can find this quicker. Writing, my routines. Okay, here we go. This is my language practice, my spelling practice. And then I found my vocabulary practice. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so besides what they had kind of embedded in the part of the teacher's guide, like the side matter and explaining what the teacher should be doing, then they also have practice for the students each day. So day 1, they did this connect the words activity where they saw questions or they had prompts related or using the words. On day 2, they did a T-chart, and they practiced basically word structure, morphology. So they took the words, so for example, they took investigation was the word, and they explored what the root of that word is, invest. Then they changed the ending to make it investigator. They made sentences with those different forms of investigate, and then they went ahead and they kept this in their word study notebook. And then they've got a day 3, a day 3, a day 4, and a day 5 activity. So I went then after to my template and I included those. So you'll see I have some other practices that I went. I talked about the figurative language practice that they did, but then I went here and I described what they did on day 2, what they did on day 3, 4, and 5. So really you want to look at your program for everything related to the vocabulary instruction if you are focused on vocabulary. So let's say I was now done with laying out how the vocabulary instruction is delivered. I focused on kind of what the teacher does. I focused on the practice that the students get, the activities that they do. Then what I did was I wanted to find out, is there evidence that these practices are indeed best practice? So the vocabulary chapter outlines the 5, they call them the guidelines here, 5 principles of effective vocabulary instruction. And so which the book does in most chapters, not gives you guidelines, but it really breaks down kind of what the best practice is and then describes how you might implement that best practice or what that might look like in the classroom, much in the way our lenses text talked about what the theory was and then talked about what that might look like in the classroom. This book kind of does the same thing. So what I did was I started reading my chapter, and as I found examples, I thought back to the practices that I've already listed and outlined, and I said, oh, this is, you know, when they did XYZ, it was an example of this. So that's why I recommend that you start kind of by not looking at your chapter per se, but rather looking at the practices that are in the program and describing those first, because then you can go ahead and you can plug things in. So I noticed as I was reading, I actually started down here I found Guideline 2. So Guideline 2 is developing students as independent word learners, and morphology is a big part of that, so teaching them the morphological strategies. So I found here that when the teacher selected the vocabulary words and they made that chart with investigated, invest and investigator, that was good practice for teaching students morphology, teaching them how about root words or base words, and then how the endings or the affixes, so suffixes or prefixes, can change the meaning of a word. And what it does was it didn't just teach that as a concept, it gave the students practice so that they can build those skills themselves, and then that would be a strategy that later on they can apply when they encounter a new word. So that was, Guideline 2. It didn't say necessarily teach morphology, but Guideline 2 was developing students as independent word learners, and that is a strategy that does indeed do that. And in the chapter, if you read that vocabulary piece, you'll see that they do talk about morphology under that part, and talking about how Guideline 2 would translate into practice. That is one example. Another example of a morphological strategy is cognates, and the book talked about cognates, and I said, oh, my program did give them cognates too. So I went ahead here and I described, again, Guideline 2, and then how this is an example of Guideline 2. Then I went on in my chapter and I read Guideline 3, so using strategies that are effective for teaching vocabulary and model good word learning behaviors. So kind of related to Guideline 3, but a little more explicit. And one of those is asking and answering questions about words, because it exposes students to facets of meaning. So, what a word means and how meanings relate to a word, and how that influences how the word is used in context. And so by, rather than simply having the students write a sentence using the word design, they write a question, and then they get to discuss the answer to that question. So it helps build their conceptual knowledge about the word design. So not just as a word, as a vocabulary word, but in the larger sense of building schema around the word design, which is really good practice. And I did find evidence to support that in my chapter, in their discussion of an activity like that. So I could put in here that that was where I found it. So I can continue, which I won't, because this is your assignment, not mine. But basically go through your chapters that you read, and you can really start to plug in why those strategies, or why those instructional activities or that instruction is best practice. So then after you do that, and you may have a practice or two that you cannot find evidence of best practice for, and that's fine, because you can talk about that in your narrative. If it's an activity that you can't somehow connect to one of the best practices that's described in your chapter, or if you perhaps know of best practices because you've read something else, another text resource you have, an article, something you've learned in class, if you can't find anything that connects that particular practice to a best practice, that's okay, because the triangulated analysis, kind of unlike the theoretical perspectives a little bit, is more an analysis of strengths and weaknesses of the program. So at the end of your analysis, you are going to write a narrative. And so this narrative is where you can discuss kind of what you felt was missing in the program related to best practices, or if you found practices that you really couldn't associate with any evidence of best practice. So writing this down now on the template, at the end of the template, is going to help you, because when we do kind of the putting it all together in a couple of weeks, you're going to need to write more in narrative form, the discussion of the strengths and the weaknesses of the overall program. So there's no minimum or maximum for you to write this narrative at this point for this week, but I'm kind of thinking about a page should do it. So you're likely going to find a few missing items. You're likely going to have one or two practices that you really can't say whether or not that's the best practice. You might just even have questions about it. And so include that in your narrative. So just as a quick example, I noticed that in the week that I was able to look at, because like again, I only have the 1 week of this particular program, but in the week I noticed that there's pretty much zero use of semantic mapping or graphic organizing related to vocabulary. And I know that that's a best practice for vocabulary, and so I would then want to include that in my narrative. So remember before when I said, even though you only are going to look at the 1 week, you're going to want to kind of go through the rest of the program to see how they handle vocabulary instruction, because maybe for some reason in this program week 4 was just a week where they didn't do any semantic mapping in relation to vocabulary, but then when I quickly looked at weeks 1, 2, and 3 I saw, oh, they did a ton of it, so then I might not add this to my analysis piece. So just be focused, but then also look a little bit broad. So you don't have to write down 70 practices related to vocabulary, but you should include enough so that the reader, me, or anybody else looking at it would really get a sense of how this program tackles vocabulary instruction. All right, so what you have then do is this template, and I will have this example up, but I'm actually not going to include an actual template because I've noticed that a lot of folks had problems with the formatting. So just go ahead and make a table in Word and have the same headings, and then you can just include your narrative at the end of it. Like I said, no minimum, no maximum. I would say somewhere around a page should be good. I'm going to ask you to stay away from just bulleting it unless your bullets are very specific and include description and analysis in your bullet point when you talk about strengths and weaknesses. So again, like last week, this will be worth 10 points. I will take a look at it. I will give you some feedback, and then we will be ready to move on to the next section. So yeah, so this week, that's what we're really going to focus on. We're going to focus on getting this piece done. We're going to focus on best practice. So there really is no reading that's not related to best practice, and there are going to be no assignments, no other screencasts related to best practice other than getting this assignment done. And there will be directions for what you need to do in the forum related to this for this week. All right, so have a great week. And now you're looking at my email. There we go. Move this up. There we go.